So sorry," he apologized again, when he lifted his mouth to stare down into her face tenderly before dropping back down to claim her lips again. His kiss was tender and loving and, as a result, Bronwyn found herself helplessly responding to it. Her lips opened up and welcomed him in, and his tongue happily accepted the invitation, gently courting and coaxing hers. His hands moved down the slim column of her neck, to her shoulders, stroking every centimeter of silky skin he encountered. His lips followed his hands down. She felt his hot, moist breath on her sensitive skin as he worked his way down, kissing every inch of available skin. She cried out when she felt his breath on one tautly beaded nipple through the thin cotton material of her top. His mouth moved over the nipple and he very deliberately breathed onto the bud through the cotton. The material sensuously abraded the sensitive peak, while his fingers fluttered up and down the small slope of her breast, circling, taunting but not quite touching the eager tip. Bronwyn sobbed desperately as she wondered how he had gotten her so hot, so fast. He glanced up into her face, over the small mound of the breast, and grinned almost satanically. He hovered for an endless moment before bending his head and drawing the tight nub of her nipple, cotton and all, deeply into his hot, wet mouth. At the same time he buried his free hand between her legs and found the other eager nub and desperate for his touch through her silky underwear. It was like being jolted by a huge bolt of lightning. She screamed and arched off the bed as she climaxed unexpectedly and with ferocious force. Her back bowed and she remained taut for what seemed like an eternity, as the spasms went on, while he drew her nipple deeper and deeper into his mouth. He had one hand cupped in the nape of her neck with the other still buried between her legs and kept them there even after she went completely boneless and collapsed back onto the bed. He lifted his head to chuckle hoarsely. "You're so bloody gorgeous," he whispered as he gave her one final stroke with his long finger before moving his hand to rest on her heaving stomach. She barely heard him over the thunderous crashing of her heart. She could hardly move and she was only just aware of him dragging her top off and tossing it aside. He went back to work, kissing her skin, licking, sucking, and nipping reverently. Bronwyn tried to regain her equilibrium, but it was an impossible task when Bryce was so determinedly keeping her off-kilter, was patient and undemanding, and Bronwyn sighed dreamily, feeling ridiculously relaxed after her massive orgasm, while his sweeping hands and loving mouth continued to do deliciously wicked things to her. Gradually, his relentless patience started to have an undeniable effect on her. Her nipples had beaded back into tight, hard nuggets, and her breathing became more and more ragged as he kissed and caressed his way over her entire body, front and back. Her panties had long since disappeared, and she became sharply aware of that fact when his lips found their way to her flat stomach. His tongue swirled in and around the dent of her belly button, and she helplessly shifted her hips, encouraging him to move even lower. She was amazed by how quickly he had managed to get her so incredibly aroused again after her earlier climax. All thought fled her mind when his talented mouth found the moist core of her femininity, and she shuddered violently with every stroke of his tongue. She barely had time to brace herself before a second, even bigger climax had her writhing around in ecstatic agony. He managed to still her helplessly thrusting hips between his large hands as he continued to lave her with his incredibly clever tongue. "Stop," she whispered, unable to tolerate the overwhelming sensations for much longer. But of course he could not hear her and continued to relentlessly coax the almost painfully pleasurable response from her. He made her come again and again until Bronwyn, so overly sensitive after her repeated orgasms, had to pull at his hair to make him stop. Bryce dragged himself up over her body and braced himself above her to stare down into her sweaty face. His eyes were smiling down into hers and he looked justifiably smug. "Wow," she whispered after her climactic shudders eventually stopped. It was light enough now for him to read her lips, and his smile widened into a grin. She glanced down between their bodies and noticed that his boxers had disappeared and that he was still very aroused. She comprehended how incredibly one-sided this entire experience had been, and she reached down to touch him. He hissed when her fingers closed around him and groaned when she stroked his hard, hot length lazily. "No," he whispered, when she tried to guide him to her and she frowned up at him. "I don't think it would be a good idea." "Why not?" she asked in confusion. "Because you'll hate me if we do." No, she denied. I won't. I'm not that unfair, Bryce. We both want this. I want this. Please. He was helplessly thrusting himself against her hand, and she once again tried to bring him to her. No, sweetheart, he managed tightly. Just your hand. We don't have to go further than that. Just your hand is fine. No, she protested again. Why wouldn't he make love to her? Her hand loosened and he groaned before reaching down and tightening his own hand over hers. Don't let go, he begged hoarsely. Bryce, please make love to me. He groaned again and let go of her hand. She released him, her hands moving up to stroke and caress the rest of his body instead. I'm sorry, he apologized. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to hold you. I know, she appeased, kissing his chest and neck lovingly before raising her head to meet his eyes. It's okay. No, he whispered quietly. No, it's not. He hovered for a moment before, with a growl of brutal self-denial, he dragged himself out of her arms and off the bed all in one swift movement. He stood at the side of the bed, gloriously naked and painfully aroused, to stare at her for a heartbeat before turning away and heading toward the ensuite. Bronwyn watched the door close gently behind him and an instant later, heard the shower going on. She turned her face into the pillow with an anguished sob and wondered at the amount of self-control it must have taken for him to get up and leave her. She was tempted to join him in the shower, but she knew that he believed he had done the right thing. She could not undermine the sacrifice he had just made by stepping into that shower with him. She dragged herself out of the warm bed and to her own room. Knowing that she would get no more sleep that morning, she showered as well and tried not to think about how difficult it would be to get through the day ahead. Chapter TWELVE. Getting through the day really was a lot harder than she had anticipated once she remembered her appointment with the lawyer that afternoon. She was so tempted to let it slide, especially after the wonderful weekend the Palmer family had just enjoyed, but she couldn't keep leaving things up in the air like this. The weekend and the incident between her and Bryce that morning had complicated matters, but it hadn't really changed the big picture. The marriage was over, and it had been over for a very long time. It was with a heavy heart that she kept her appointment after her morning lectures and started the divorce proceedings. Jason Goodson, her attorney, had been a bit dismayed to discover that despite Bryce's sizable assets, Bronwyn wanted nothing from him other than continued child support and joint custody. Goodson had tried to dissuade her from this course of action, but she had remained firm in her decision until he'd had no choice but to accept his client's wishes. Getting through the rest of the afternoon was hell. Nothing seemed to go right, she couldn't concentrate enough to get any studying done, and the bookshop was even quieter than usual. It offered no distraction from her inner turmoil. To top off a truly miserable day, after she finished work she discovered that she had a flat tire on her brand spanking new car. To make matters even worse, her cell phone battery had died and she didn't have her charger. Of all days to have given Paul the day off, this was the one time she could actually have used his help. Sobbing with frustration, she returned to the shop to call the Automobile Association and then waited nearly half an hour for them to arrive. Luckily, she had discovered the flat tire before leaving work and could safely wait for the AA inside the shop. By the time they had fixed the tire, she was nearly an hour late and the autumn sun had already disappeared behind the mountain. When she got home it was to find Bryce in the kitchen feeding a happily chattering Kayla. The toddler was intent on redistributing clumps of mashed potatoes from her bowl to her chubby fists and onto her hair. Bryce looked up when Bronwyn entered his field of vision, and his indulgent smile immediately faded. Where the hell have you been? He asked in a controlled voice, his face dark with tightly leashed anger. I've been going out of my mind with worry. I had a flat tire, she explained tiredly, dropping her bag onto the kitchen table and sitting down next to Kayla, picking up a damp cloth to wipe the food from the little girl's face and hair. The AA guys thought it may have been a slow puncture that I picked up on one of the gravel roads yesterday. I've been sending message after message and getting zero response from you, he growled, still in that frighteningly controlled voice. Well, my battery died. She shrugged, doggedly wiping the smudges from Kayla's face despite the child's frantically shaking head. "I'm sorry," he swore, startling both her and Kayla, before handing the toddler's spoon to Bronwyn and stalking from the kitchen. "Daddy, go away," Kayla informed redundantly, waving happily at the door through which her father had disappeared. Bronwyn sighed and dropped a kiss onto the child's silky curls, grimacing when her lips met a clump of cold food. "You need a bath, little girl," she groaned, overcome with exhaustion at the mere thought of it, when all she wanted was to soak her own weary bones. "Want a bubble bath with Mummy?" Kayla grinned and nodded happily, starting to sing a tuneless song occasionally peppered with words like mummy, bath, happy, bubbles, and play. The rest was complete gibberish. Bronwyn laughed as she carried the child up to the master bath, wishing Bryce could hear the charming little ditty. They were soon happily settled in the huge round tub and immersed in fragrant warm water. Kayla was on Bronwyn's lap and both of them were enjoying the massive amount of bubbles in the tub when Bryce walked in. He halted at the door, visibly surprised to see his wife and child sporting foam bubble caps and beards. Bronwyn yelped, feeling like an idiot for not locking the door, but she had been so preoccupied with Kayla that she hadn't even thought about it. "Daddy," the child squealed, happy to see him as always. "BAF? Not right now, sweetheart." He shook his head regretfully, raising a wicked eyebrow at Bronwyn. "Although I would love to." She rolled her eyes at the pathetic attempt at a leer and he chuckled. "Sorry, Bron, I thought you were giving her a bath. I didn't know you were in the tub with her. I'll talk to you later." He turned to leave. "Daddy, no go," Kayla demanded, fiercely unhappy that her father was about to leave. Bronwyn groaned and buried her face between the child's fragile shoulder blades, then looked up to meet his amused eyes. "You might as well stay. She'll be insufferable if you don't," Bronwyn said. He nodded, lowering the lid on the commode and sitting down, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his denim-clad thighs and his hands loosely clasped between his knees. Happy that her daddy was watching, Kayla launched into full show-off mode. She decorated her mother's face and hair with more bubbles before dragging a plastic doll into the water and starting a chatty tea party with it. Soon she was totally absorbed in her game, and Bryce shifted his beautiful eyes from child to disconcerted mother. "I didn't mean to lose my temper earlier," he murmured. "I know." She shrugged, shampooing Kayla's hair while the child continued to play. "You were worried." "I'm sorry. I was imagining all the worst scenarios," he admitted, lowering his eyes to his hands. "I was on the verge of calling the police. I'd already decided I would once I'd finished feeding Kayla." Because his eyes weren't on her, she chose not to respond to that. "I regret this morning too," he said after a prolonged silence interrupted only by Kayla's happy chatter. This time he did raise his eyes to her face. He looked both uncomfortable and sincere. "I know," she said again. "But even though I couldn't really see it this morning, you did the right thing by leaving." "It nearly killed me," he admitted gruffly. "I know it wasn't easy." She nodded. "But thank you. I'm sorry for pressuring you to stay. It would only have led to even bigger regrets." She grabbed the shower head and started to rinse Kayla's hair. The child squirmed irritably when it interfered with her game. "Kayla, sit still." Her mother's tone brooked no argument. Kayla stopped moving and sulkily leaned back against Bronwyn's chest. Bryce watched the two of them with a slightly dazed smile on his lips, and Bronwyn frowned, unable to interpret the expression on his face. "You're both so beautiful," he whispered, sounding awed and humbled. He looked so possessively proud that Bronwyn squirmed uncomfortably. "Bryce." He didn't see her lips form his name. Instead, he reached for a small towel and draped it over Kayla's hair, knotting it turban style around her head. He reached for another, bigger towel and opened it up, patiently waiting for Bronwyn to finish soaping and rinsing their daughter before kneeling beside the tub to reach for the squirming toddler. His white t-shirt immediately got drenched when he wrapped the small child in the towel. He picked her up before nodding down at Bronwyn, who immediately sank down beneath the rapidly dissipating bubbles. "I'll take it from here. You enjoy the rest of your bath," he urged, and she smiled gratefully, watching his tall, well-built form as he retreated from the bathroom. "Oh God," she moaned, burying her face in her wet hands. This was going to be so difficult. She straightened her narrow shoulders resolutely before finishing her bath and heading off to find her husband. He was in Calla's room, reading the sleepy little girl a bedtime story. Bronwyn watched silently from the doorway, unseen by both father and daughter, until eventually Calla fell asleep. Bryce stopped reading and leaned down to drop a kiss on Calla's baby-soft cheek. "Good night, Angel," he murmured, so quietly Bronwyn nearly missed it. When he got up and turned around, he seemed unsurprised to find her standing in the doorway. She came forward and dropped her own goodnight kiss on Calla's cheek before straightening to meet his gaze unflinchingly. "We need to talk," she said, and he nodded. She led the way out of the room and downstairs to the living room. She couldn't do this in the conservatory, not where they had shared so many experiences, both good and bad. He headed straight to the drinks cabinet and poured 2 glasses of neat scotch, seeming to realize that they would need it. He handed her one of the heavy, crystal glasses and gestured toward 2 comfortable chairs. "Shall we?" She nodded, sitting down opposite him and taking a nervous sip of the fiery liquid that swirled so prettily in the glass. She coughed and he grinned. "Still can't hold your liquor, I see," he teased. "Bryce, I filed for a divorce today," she said very quickly. His grin faded, and he went as white as a sheet. His eyes dropped to his glass and he lifted it to his lips with a somewhat shaky hand before downing the contents in one gulp. "I see. I want nothing from you," she continued hastily when his eyes lifted to meet hers again. "Just what we discussed before, child support and joint custody." He got up and headed back to the drinks cabinet. He refilled his glass, doubling the amount this time. When he sat back down, he said nothing, merely drank down half of the liquor with a slight shudder. "Say something," she urged. "Nothing more to say." He shrugged. "Nothing more to do really, except sit here and get very, very drunk." "Bryce," she admonished, but he didn't see her lips form his name because he was up once again, refilling his glass. When he returned to his seat this time, he brought the decanter with him and held it up to her with a questioning tilt of his head. "You want some?" he invited, indicating toward her barely touched alcohol. "Bryce, we need to talk." He laughed rudely, sounding anything but amused. "About what, goddammit?" His voice rose and she jumped in fright. "You always want to talk, but nothing much ever gets said. You want a divorce, you want child support, and you want joint custody? Fine, they're yours. I'll throw in the house in Nisna and a few million too. How does that sound?" "I don't want those things." "Of course you don't," he sneered. "You're too good for my money, for my apologies, and for my love, aren't you?" That did it. Bronwyn jumped up and, before she really had time to think about her actions, tossed the rest of her drink into his sneering face. She waited for him to blink the stinging alcohol from his eyes before she laid into him. "What apologies? What love?" She both signed and screamed at him. "So far I haven't heard a word of apology from you. Not for tossing me out or for misjudging me. And you haven't once, not once since our wedding, since before our wedding for that matter, told me that you love me. In fact, you did the polar opposite of that. You told me that you married me out of duty, that you'd never loved me. Are you telling me different now, Bryce? Make up your damned mind, because I'm getting sick of your multiple personality disorder." "Bronwyn, no. You have the utter gall to tell me that nothing much ever gets said." She was still using hands and mouth to make it absolutely clear how she felt. She didn't want him to miss a single word. "Well, whose fault is that, Bryce? You've never really opened up to me. Trying to learn anything at all about you is like extracting blood from a stone. I was happy with our marriage before I left, but after being on my own for 2 years and really thinking about it, I recognized how completely screwed up our relationship was. It was all give from me and nothing but take from you. You hide yourself so completely from me that I wonder if the man I fell in love with ever really existed. So, you're right, the time for talking is over. I'll stay in this house as per our agreement, but this divorce will happen. Why are you suddenly so desperate for a divorce? He asked suspiciously. Is it that professor? Are you leaving me for him? How can I leave you when we're not even together? She asked in exasperation. She was frustrated that none of her words seemed to be sinking in. And no, I don't want a divorce because of Raymond. I doubt I'll see him again outside of school. And just because you've played away during this marriage doesn't mean that I will. He looked completely confounded by her words and signaled for her to repeat them, evidently thinking he'd misread her words. When she repeated what she'd said, his jaw dropped to his chest as he stared at her in obvious shock. What the hell are you talking about? He asked. He was still sitting down, insouciantly sipping at his scotch, even though the alcohol she had tossed on him had drenched his head and shoulders. Bronwyn was still standing and glowering down at him. I haven't played away as you so eloquently put it. You're the one who told me that your sex life was just fine, remember? What else was I supposed to gather from that statement? He choked on a sip of scotch and coughed for a few minutes before eventually blinking rapidly to clear his eyes and stare at her stupidly again. Bronwyn. I was in an accident. I spent 6 months convalescing, a year in therapy, and the rest of the time actively avoiding crowds. I went out only once, and that was to a surprise party for Teresa DeLucci just a couple of weeks before we found you again. When do you think I had time to shag other women? You said, okay, so maybe he'd lied. I was trying to save face. You were asking me about sex and all I could think about was getting you naked and beneath me again. Hardly something I wanted to advertise when I was still so angry with you. But the condoms? What? In the pedestal drawer, she elaborated, and his lips twitched. Rick and Lisa have used that room in the past, and while they did the responsible thing in purchasing condoms, they never really got around to using them, and she got pregnant faster than you could blink. He stared levelly up at her for a beat before grinning wickedly. Were you jealous, Bron? Damn him, not at all. She kept her face expressionless but couldn't quite hide the betraying flush from him. I just thought you were a hypocrite for getting weird about Raymond when you'd all but admitted to sleeping with other women. It doesn't matter anymore anyway. The divorce still stands. Her words brought the reality of their situation back to him and he sobered immediately. I want to pick up the pieces of my life and move on. I just can't be happy living like this. He stood up, towering above her, and his eyes bored desperately into hers. We can be a family, Bronwyn, he urged, holding out an imploring hand. This weekend proved that. No, all this weekend proved is that you still have secrets that you refuse to share with me. And it will always be that way, won't it, Bryce? You will always close off some part of yourself from me. I've never really known you and I doubt that I ever will. Sweetheart, please, he groaned. Don't call me that, she said. She just felt tired and defeated. He stood there, hands still outstretched and looking miserable, with alcohol dripping from his hair and into his eyes. For a very brief moment she felt herself softening. I know that I've been an utter bastard, he admitted, yes. His admission strengthened her resolve. I'm sorry. Is that a question? Or an actual apology? He hesitated briefly, and she rolled her eyes. Get back to me when you know for sure. She swept from the room, and Bryce stared at the door for a long time after she'd left. Now that this whole divorce thing was becoming a palpable fact, he admitted to himself that he wasn't quite so willing to roll over and give her everything that she asked for. He wanted his wife and child, but he was a broken man, both physically and emotionally, and it hardly seemed fair to saddle her with his innumerable problems after everything that he had already put her through. Yet he knew that without her he'd go back to being the empty husk he'd been after she'd left. He sighed and corrected the thought after he'd driven her away. 2 years ago he had been careless with the most precious thing in his world and had lost it as a result. He wished that there were some way to regain her trust and reconcile with her, but in his heart he didn't think he deserved that much anymore. You still with us, Bronwyn? Bronwyn blinked when a slender hand was waved in front of her face and she saw that the 4 other women sitting at the restaurant table were staring at her expectantly. They had been discussing Teresa's marriage renewal ceremony, which was coming up later in the year. The other women were excitedly exchanging ideas for the event. "Sorry, I missed that," she muttered, and Alice snorted. "You've missed large chunks of the conversation from what I could tell," the other woman said with raised eyebrows. "What's going on with you? You checked out of this conversation before it even started." "I'm divorcing Bryce," Bronwyn told them after taking a fortifying sip of alcohol. It had been a difficult week. She and Bryce had barely spoken since Monday, even though he had tried to approach her on numerous occasions. She'd spent her time actively avoiding him and felt like a rank coward because of it. Seriously? Lisa looked stunned by the information, and the other women were all staring at her sympathetically. "Yes. I've spoken to a lawyer. But I thought things were getting better." Lisa looked devastated by the information, and Bronwyn sighed quietly before shaking her head. "No, the plan has always been to get a divorce. We're living together because it's convenient right now and less stressful for Kayla, but as soon as I graduate and find a job, I'm leaving. But that will take years." Teresa unknowingly echoed the words Bronwyn had spoken to Bryce when he'd first suggested his house-sharing idea to her. "Yes, and it does bother me. I really don't want to take advantage of Bryce's generosity." "Oh, bullcrap." Teresa cut her off with what for her was uncharacteristically strong language. "You're the mother of his child, and you spent the first year and a half of Kala's life struggling to take care of her at the cost of your own health. So don't you dare feel bad about accepting the aid that you're entitled to receive from the father of your child. It's the very least he can do." The other women stared at Teresa in surprise, and she looked a little uncomfortable before shrugging. "It's something I feel strongly about." Bronwyn smiled before nodding her agreement. "You're right, Teresa, but Bryce has suffered too. He missed the first year and a half of Kayla's life, and he had that accident while following me, and we all know how that ended. All things that could have been avoided if he'd acted less like an arse after he discovered that you were pregnant," Lisa pointed out reasonably. "Yes, what married man reacts like that to the news that he's going to be a father, anyway?" Alice added her 2 cents worth. "I like Bryce, but seriously, that was a jerk move. I think that everything will seem a lot less complicated after a couple of drinks," Roberta Richmond, who had joined their group for the first time that night, suggested with a decisive nod. She wasn't quite up to speed on the Bronwyn and Bryce situation, but she showed her solidarity by ordering a round of drinks, even though she kept herself restricted to non-alcoholic cocktails. The woman, at 26, was a couple of years younger than Bronwyn and was a friend of Teresa's. Apparently they had met at some football thing that Sandro, Teresa's husband, attended regularly. The tomboyish young woman was now the only single, childless member of their group. Teresa had informed them before inviting Bobby, as she preferred to be called, that the other woman had very few female friends. Bronwyn liked her positive energy. She was a good addition to their little group. They spent the rest of the day tossing back cocktails, and, in an effort to cheer her up, the other women started offering Bronwyn all kinds of increasingly bawdy advice on how she could bounce back from her divorce. One of them suggested Bronwyn hook up with a male stripper, which actually made very little sense, but they weren't very sensible by that point. "I guarantee a male stripper would know what to do between the sheets." Lisa nodded knowingly. "Please, like you'd know," Teresa scoffed. "I heard they are mostly gay," Bronwyn ventured. "No way." Alice looked disappointed by the very idea. "We should do some research," Bobby mused, licking the salt off her margarita glass. "Find a stripper and ask him if he's gay." "Where are we going to find a stripper?" Bronwyn asked, curious, more than a little tipsy. "I know a place," the very shy and straight-laced Teresa, of all people, volunteered. "Stop it," Lisa gasped, scandalized. "You do not." "I do," Teresa maintained smugly. "I saw a documentary about it last week." "Well, what are we waiting for then?" Alice asked eagerly. "Let's go find us some strippers." Bryce always positioned himself in a room that would get hit by any car headlights whenever he knew Bronwyn was going to be out late. That way he could be certain she was home safely before heading to bed. He would never be able to sleep if he knew she was still out. He always worried about whether she was safe when she was out late with her bunch of gal pals. Unfortunately, the women were all quite adamant that security not be present at their gatherings. But the men had collectively agreed to always have at least one guy incognito and keeping an eye on them. Still, it didn't prevent Bryce from getting stressed out every time it got a little too close to midnight on these girly Saturdays. Right now it was after midnight, and the responses he'd received to the frantic SMSs he'd sent to both Rick and Pierre, whose guy had security detail that night, had been pretty similar. "Chill out bro, they're fine and relax. I've checked. There's nothing to worry about." He supposed he would have to be content with that. At long last, close to 1 in the morning, the headlights swept up the drive, and he leaped up from the sofa in the den and headed to the front door, fury mixed with the relief he felt. Strangely enough, the headlights were sweeping back down the drive just as he got to the front door, and he was still trying to figure out what that meant when the door swung open. His wife staggered, that was the only word he could think of to describe her movement, into the foyer. Her face lit up when she saw him, and he blinked in surprise until the fumes hit him. "You're drunk," he accused in disbelief. That explained the headlights. She had probably come home by taxi. She said something that he didn't quite catch, and he imagined that she was probably slurring her words. She held her hand up, thumb and forefinger an inch apart, and he shook his head. "More than a little, Bronwyn. Where the hell have you been?" She winced and rubbed her ears and spoke again, and he caught enough of her words to comprehend that he'd probably used a little too much volume on the question. He took a deep, calming breath like his speech therapist had taught him to, and repeated the question in what he hoped was a quieter voice. It was always hard to judge when he was feeling this riled up. "With girls." He caught just the tail end of that, but it was enough. "You've been out with the girls before, but never till nearly 1 in the morning," he said, seething. "You're not my dad." She signed sloppily before trying to weave her way past him. She lacked the necessary coordination though, and instead walked right into him. Bryce grabbed her upper arms and steadied her. She smiled blindingly up at him before quite unexpectedly running her hands over his bare forearms and then up over his biceps. He was so distracted by her touch that for a second he didn't know that she was speaking. Her eyes had glazed over with familiar desire, and she seemed to be talking more to herself than him. He tried to focus on her lips and not on his burgeoning erection, but it still took a few moments before any of what she was saying sank in. "Stripper?" Okay, this time he knew he was bellowing. "What stripper?" To his utter disappointment, she stopped her seductive stroking of his skin and frowned up at him. She lifted one of her hands from his arm and raised a forefinger to her lips in the universal shushing gesture. "What stripper?" he asked again, in what he knew was a whisper, and she rolled her eyes. "Massive Marvin," she informed him helpfully, but then removed her other hand from his overheated skin to say the rest in clumsy sign language. "But he's not that massive. You're much bigger than he is." She paused thoughtfully while she ran her eyes over his body and then switched back to words. "Much bigger, all over." "Right." That last gesture was not exactly standard sign language, but accompanied by the look she directed downward, it was quite unmistakable and very flattering. He felt his face heating and his body hardening even more. He watched as her eyebrows sprang almost all the way to her hairline as she recognized what was happening to him. She raised her glassy eyes to his once more and licked her lips hungrily. God, he knew that look. She wanted him as much as he wanted her, but she was so drunk that he knew it would be wrong to act on their mutual need right then. Sleeping with her while she was wasted was not part of his reconciliation plan. Okay, he still had no real idea what the hell his reconciliation plan was, but he was pretty sure that sleeping with her right now would not be the best first step. "He's gay," she said. Her lips formed the words clearly enough, and he frowned in confusion at the non sequitur. "What?" he asked. She was so bloody enchanting like this, but at the same time utterly confounding. "Massive Marvin. He's gay."